It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Jennifer Kimball. She's an assistant professor, part of the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics at University of Minnesota. And we're going to talk about her work with breeding wild rice and other types of issues. So, Jennifer, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background, and then why rice, why you're studying it, and then we'll get into your current work.
So yeah, I'm a plant breeder by trade, which means that I primarily focus on developing new and improved cultivars for crops. Specifically, I work with cultivated wild rice, which is a crop species that we grow up here in Minnesota, and a little bit is grown in California as well. So we're a smaller industry, but we've got a great group of growers. So I primarily work a lot with farmers, and that's one of the reasons that I love this job.
And why rice? What attracts you to it?
Oh, so I got
Besides, it can be delicious, but what's the other
reason? Yeah, wild rice is a super nutritious grain, and it's got a really nice, unique, nutty flavor. But after I graduated with my bachelor's in biology, I was in Ithaca, New York, at Ithaca College, and I jumped across the hill and started working at Cornell University. And I was working for Dr. Susan McCooch, who is white rice breeder and geneticist. And I was learning all about wild species of white rice and the diversity that is there within those species. And I was just absolutely fascinated by it, captivated, and just fell in love with genetic diversity, all of the different traits and variation that you can see across the plant species. And then I went down to North Carolina for about 10 years to get my master's and my PhD. I was down in the South. I'm from New York. I never really acclimated well to the heat. I knew I wanted to be a plant breeder, but I needed to get somewhere cold. And I also grew up in the Finger Lakes region of New York State, which there's tons of really beautiful, gorgeous lakes around there. And so this position popped up where I could breed in a cold environment. I could work on a species that's really closely related to white rice. It's like a cousin. And, Minnesota is the state of 10,000 lakes. So I was able to get back to the lake life. So sort of this perfect situation for me.
Yeah, I remember the land of lakes butter. That's Minnesota land of lakes.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
So rice, I don't really know much about it. Does it have to be grown submerged in water in like a paddy, or can different kinds of rice be grown differently?
Yeah, no, right now, wild rice, we plant it on dry land, just like you would any other crop. and then we flood immediately. And those patties stay flooded roughly until the plant starts to flower and set seed. And then we start to drain those patties to firm up the ground so we can get our mechanical harvesters, our combines in there to collect the seed.
And how long does rice take to come to flower and then to produce the rice itself?
Let's see.
And how many grains are produced on each plant, etc.?
Yeah, so it typically takes about 4 months. Here in Minnesota, we plant roughly in May, and then we're harvesting early September, or mid-September, depending on the year. Every year, it's a different environment. And this is a plant that looks a lot like white rice. It has one main stem with a panicle on the top. And that's where we're going to get our main seed production. But the plant also tillers, so it sends out more shoots from the base of the plant, and they will flower as well. So if you could think of white rice, kind of maybe looks a little like wheat or oats, that typical grass structure.
I've heard that I know it's very difficult to work it as a farmer, but maybe I'm thinking of harvesting rice by hand in China. Like, is it a very difficult plant? So what are some of the nuances of it?
Oh yeah, it is a challenging crop to work with. This is a lowland crop, so it does have water and flooding that we have to control. And then there's also a lot of more environmental management, I think, because we really have to pay attention into what we're putting into the water when we're releasing it, making sure that we're being as sustainable and environmentally friendly as possible. So the industry itself has done a ton of work in this area, and I'm really proud to be working with them. One of the amazing things and really unique things about going onto a cultivated wild rice farm is it's flooded, and there's all these dikes and tons of just so much diversity in plant life on these dikes, and as well as there's water. So we get tons of waterfowl. I breed probably 10,000 tadpoles in my patties every year. And we have snapping turtles and crabs. I mean, it's just the abundance of life and diversity that you see in cultivated wild rice production systems is really unique, because if you look across the landscape, I think especially in the Midwest, the landscape's dominated by corn and soybean. And so we try to rotate crops as much as we can to benefit the soil and to maximize the yield for growers. But those are largely monocultures and typically of the same cultivar, which is all the plants within a cultivar are genetically identical. So you get this monoculture landscape that, doesn't have the diversity that can really benefit the environment and the local landscape in a positive way. And I think that's one thing I absolutely love about working on wild rice.
What are some of the companion plants that can be grown maybe alongside rice or before and after? Or you mentioned a lot of the animals that come there, which is great. But what else?
Yeah, so typically here in Minnesota, we do have rotation crops. That depends kind of where you are in the state, which different growing region in the state. Most of the growers in the cultivated wild rice industry are in the northern part of the state. Wild rice really likes the cold, so it's my buddy in that sense. Yeah, so we do have rotation crops, and that is going to depend, again, like I said, on the region that we're growing in the state. Mostly it's soybeans. There's some peas that are grown, wheat, but yeah, I mean, since we are in the northern range of Minnesota and we're on some lowlands lands, we're limited, I think, in what rotation crops. But soybean in general is really great because it's got that symbiotic relationship with nitrogen fixing bacteria. So when the growers rotate with soybeans and a patty is coming off of soybeans, it's actually, the soil is wonderful because it's gotten some of the nitrogen already in place from growing soybeans. So soybean is just an absolutely excellent rotation crop in that sense.
If you grew in warmer weather, would it attract mosquitoes to the water? In the cold climate, does that save you from mosquitoes and Can the water be fouled by something?
We do. Yeah, we do have mosquitoes sometimes. I think they probably have more problems with that in California because the environment is just, consistently warmer, I think. Here in northern Minnesota, we got a pretty intense winter. I think it's -6 out there right now. And so I don't think we have as many problems with that.
Yeah, I was wondering. Well, I mean, you said May and harvest in September. So what's the temperature range around then? And again, what kind of creatures hang out near the rice?
Yeah, so in May, we're planting typically in 50, 60-degree Fahrenheit weather. And then in August, it's probably 70 maybe. So we really don't get, June, July, we get some hot weather events, but typically we're, I think, much, much cooler than most of the country.
So what are some of the research you're doing right now on rice? Are you trying to find, hardier stocks or improve yield, or, what's the focus of your research?
Yeah, so yield is always something that's really important to us. One thing that we are focusing on is seed shattering. So all of the crops that we kind of typically know, grain crops like our wheat, our soy, our wheat, our corn, oats, they have gone through a process of domestication where for thousands of years, farmers have basically selected the best plants that they have wanted for their environment, for their traits of interest. That has led to the crops that we know today. Wild rice breeding only started roughly 60 years ago. So something like corn or wheat that's been, selected upon for thousands of years, we only have 60. So we're still focusing on some of those important domestication traits. And seed shattering in particular is a very important one because.
So what is that? What happens?
Yeah, so in wild rice grows naturally in the Great Lakes region of North America. And basically seed shatter in nature is a natural seed dispersal mechanism. It's how, plants continue to populate in our natural environments. But in agricultural systems, we don't want that. We want the grain to stay on the plants long enough for our growers to go in with those combines. If we have shattering in our varieties, that means that grain's falling to the grounds before the growers can harvest it, and that's lost money, that's lost food, and we don't want that. So we're really trying to focus on seed shattering.
So does the seed literally like explode and spray, other seeds all over the place? Or what does the shattering look like? Does it just crack and the winds take it?
Yeah, so if you think about really any type of grass, white rice, let's just say, it's got a panicle or a seed head, and there's lots of seeds on that. And if you take away those seeds, there's a basic panicle or seed head structure, right? The stems that are holding the seeds onto the seed head. And what happens is as seeds are maturing on that panicle, genes get turned on and what is called an abscission layer is formed right at the base of the seed. And what that is it's a layer of cells. And so that layer, it's a thin layer of cells, and that layer of cells forms, and then something in the pathway ends up killing those cells. And that is when that abscission layer deteriorates, and it actually causes the grain to fall from the seed head. So if we can find the genes, so one thing that I'm looking at is to identify those genes in that seed shattering pathway. If we can find a different variant or a mutation in that pathway that doesn't turn on that abscission layer, then you don't have seed shattering. So we're trying to shut down those pathways.
Is it a matter of timing, or is it a matter of the formation of this layer at all, which allows seed shattering?
It's both. Yeah. So, we've done a study where we have shown we've improved seed shattering, but we haven't fixed the trait, which means we haven't made it consistent across all of our germplasm. So there's still variability in the trait. But we do know that wild populations of wild rice, they're going to start shattering anywhere from 10 to 12 days after the seed starts to set and mature. In cultivated wild rice, so in our cultivated germplasm, we've moved that and shifted that to 35 days. So there's a much bigger window now from when seed shattering begins in cultivated wild rice compared to its wild counterparts. But we still do have shattering at those 35 days. And that's where we're still getting some of that abscission layer turned on. So I think we've delayed it a little bit, but we still need to identify the genes that are conferring that pathway and the formation of that abscission layer.
Is anyone studying the molecular clocks that control various things happening in plants? How many years it takes them to go to fruit for fruit plants, et cetera, those kinds of things to speed up or slow down various processes in plants?
Yeah, I don't specifically work with molecular clocks, but I have been working to incorporate molecular-based breeding approaches into the program. Again, this is something that a lot of other crop species have a really big head start when it comes to having the resource, the genetic and the genomic resources available to do some of this molecular-based breeding. So I'm focused on, for example, identifying a gene that I know leads to shattering resistance in wild rice. If I can find that gene and then I can track it, I can use a molecular marker, which is just a short sequence, nucleotides of bases, basically, that are a part of all of our genetic code. I can use those short sequences, those molecular markers, to basically track what plants have disease or have seed shattering resistance. And that's called marker assisted selection. So what I can do is I can take that marker, I can grow a bunch of plants up in a greenhouse, I can genotype them with that marker, and then I know what plants are going to have more seed shattering resistance. And so then I rogue out or I eliminate all the plants that don't. And sometimes with a lot of traits, that's important because you're actually tracking the gene. You're not tracking a phenotype or you're not making visual assessments. And so that can really speed up the plant breeding process. So the plant breeding process, typically, depending on your crop that you're working on, it's going to take 8 to 12 years to develop a new variety. Plant breeding is a really long endeavor, and it takes significant inputs to develop these varieties. So marker assisted selection using these molecular based breeding approaches is a way to speed up that process. So we can get these new cultivars and varieties out to our growers as quickly as we can. Our environments are changing rapidly. Our landscapes are changing rapidly. And when it takes 8 to 10 to 12 years to release a cultivar, breeders really need to be looking ahead to what's the next problem while we're also trying to speed up the breeding process and get new cultivars out to our growers as quickly as possible.
How many cultivars in a given field are used? It sounds like one is a bad idea. I mean, if they're similar, why not? I know you can't talk about corn and soy and all the other stuff. Maybe you can, but why don't breeders have multiple different types of cultivars that are all similar to increase disease resistance and pest resistance, et cetera?
Yeah, so that sort of goes beyond a little bit what we do as plant breeders because that's more of management of the agricultural landscape. So, how are growers picking and choosing their cultivars? In wild rice, we have such a small industry. We typically only have about 2 to 3 cultivars grown at once at a single time. But wild rice cultivars are they're very unique in agriculture in that they're open pollinated, which means, and they're highly heterogeneous, which means every plant is unique. No one plant is the same, but they're all together a population that is better than the previous cultivar that was released. And that's different from other crop species like corn, like wheat, oats, soybean. They are inbred lines. And so they are each plant of that cultivar that you grow out is going to be genetically identical. So that's again just why I highlight some of the really cool aspects, I think, of cultivated wild rice is because we don't have that monoculture. And I think that helps with a lot of difference in a lot of different environmental conditions where you can have different soil types, different climates, you can have different pests. If you have a diverse line like that cultivar that's out there on the landscape, it has more ability to adapt and respond to different environments. An inbred line, say of corn, if a breeder in Iowa breeds something specific for that environment, it might do fantastic and it might yield really, really well. And so there's different aspects of different crops and their production systems that need to be taken into account when you think about these types of questions.
So what would be a huge breakthrough in rice? I've heard I guess the photosynthetic efficiency of rice plants is 1%, and there's some people that are trying to get it up to, let's say, 1.5%, which would be like a 50% possible increase in yield. What are some of the big possible movers of rice that you think would really improve it quite a bit for people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know for the growers, we're always looking to yield. We're always looking to reducing that seed shattering. But we also look to improve disease resistance as well as, the ability for a cultivar to withstand different weather conditions. And so, improving disease resistance, for example, would reduce the amount of pesticides, say, that a farmer has to apply to his crop. So in plant breeding, while we focus, I think, primarily on yield, there's a really environmental sustainability component to the work that we do, trying to reduce the inputs, limit the environmental degradation effects that do come about from agriculture. Like any system, there's inputs and outputs. And yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have, as we begin to explore the use of molecular-based breeding in wild rice, where we can really hone in and target our traits of interest, I think we're going to see really, well, I hope we see really pretty big, substantial increases in yield. I also work with marketers, and cultivated wild rice here in Minnesota has a very large export market, specifically to the European Union. And the European end users really want longer seed. That's something that they're interested in. So that's a primary target of my program as well. So we're not just thinking about growers, we're thinking about marketers, we're thinking about end users. I also have this really unique opportunity as we're domesticating wild rice and we're optimizing it for this agricultural paddy production system. We can focus on nutritional quality. Sometimes in breeding, when you're focused on, you have your primary trait of interest, say it's yield, sometimes there's indirect selection that happens. And what that means is that you don't realize it, but maybe you do or you don't realize it, but as you're improving one trait, you could be harming or reducing the efficiency or quality of another trait. And so something that's happened in plant breeding is over the years, as we've pushed yield in a lot of contexts, that has meant increased seed size. And sometimes when you increase seed size rapidly and we're not paying attention to how we're increasing that seed size, sometimes we end up losing some of the nutritional content of those seeds and we replace it with starch. So we have this unique opportunity in cultivated wild rice to ensure that as we're developing new and improved varieties, that we're maintaining that really good nutritional content, because wild rice nutritionally outcompetes most grain crops that are on the market.
So what kind of nutrients does it have that regular white rice or brown rice doesn't have?
It's comparable or beats brown rice in tons of different categories like antioxidants, protein levels, different micronutrients that are important for the body. Wild rice has a really large lysine content, which is a limiting factor in a lot of our grain crops. And so there's some really unique opportunities, I think, and some phenomenal nutritional characteristics of wild rice that I think put it in a really unique position in the marketplace to allow this industry to continue to grow.
Okay. One other question is, I don't know, it seems like rice cultivation would be very difficult. I don't know how much do you get off each stem or each plant? If I want a side of rice with my meal, how much did it take to produce that?
Yeah, so like one side serving is probably going to be half of a plant, maybe. I've never really thought about it that way. It's super interesting. I always love meeting and talking to new people because they ask me questions that I would just never think of. And that's a great one. But yeah, I bet a side of rice is about half of a plant. So we produce,
Okay.
I think it's something on the scale of 9 million pounds per year of wild rice. That in comparison to other crops is very, very small. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. No, I just thought it would be like a miserable type of event to harvest so many plants just to get a little bit of rice, but it sounds like each plant produces quite a bit, which is good.
Yeah.
And I always marvel how cheap a lot of produce is when, some of it takes years, and it just seems like it should be a lot more expensive.
Yeah. And wild rice, it is fairly more expensive than, your average white rice or something like that because it's only, other crops, because it's only grown in Minnesota and in small regions in California. So it's a pretty small crop. In the grocery stores, you can probably get a pound of cultivated wild rice. It's going to cost, depending on where you are, I think anywhere between $5 and $8 a pound, which, white rice, I can't think off the top of my head how much it would cost, but it's probably $3 or $4 per pound. And then hand harvested wild rice is going to probably be somewhere between $11 and $15 a pound.
Yeah, what do you think is the best place for people to see the papers you've written and the research you're working on? Where can they go?
Google Scholar, I always recommend. You just can type into the Google search engine Google Scholar, and that takes you to a specific page or function app. I don't know really what to call it. A website and it's called Google Scholar, and that's where it filters your searches for scientific publications. So, publications that are coming out in peer-reviewed journals. So I think that's always a good place to go. Anybody can go and onto my website, keep our website up to date as well.
Okay. Well, very good. Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about rice. I knew nothing about it before this, but it's a very interesting subject. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And I just want to, encourage everyone to continue to learn more about where your food comes from. Thank a farmer if you can, and, don't be afraid to get some dirt under your fingernails and grow some good food. It's a good chance to connect with nature and you can get your food supply right in your own backyard.
Actually, that leads to one last question.
Sure.
For someone that wants to do a little bit of homesteading, would you recommend they try to grow like one rice plant in a pot with some water, or is it really difficult to grow?
That's going to be really challenging. Yeah. I mean, if you have a pond, you can gather some wild rice from natural populations, put it into a mud ball, and then throw it out into your pond. And next year you should have some good wild rice stands.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are one or two useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.